Hello, everybody, and welcome to another talk at BA and Product Management Days 2021. And today I'm super excited to introduce to you our another very inspiring speaker. So Howard Podeswa is a thought leader in the intersection of agile and business analysis. For over 20 years, he has helped large organizations adapt and optimize their business analysis and planning practices for agile software development approaches. He has authored 2 books that have become stable references for practitioners: UML for the IT business analyst, which explores the BA function within an iterative, incremental process, and the Business Analyst Handbook, a reference manual for BAs in agile and traditional organizations. He recently completed a new book that updates the guidance for agile BAs and product owners. He will tell you a little bit about that during his presentation. So based on his impressive background and knowledge, Howard will talk about how to reduce rework and impediments in agile development through feature and story preparation. So without further ado, Howard, welcome. The stage is yours. Super excited to hear you.
Thank you very, very much. And thanks to everybody at, I would call it Z Days. I guess you guys call it Z Days. That's how we pronounce it here in Canada. Thanks for everybody for coming. I'm sure many of you are pretty zoomed out by now, so I do appreciate the time. As was mentioned, we're going to be, what I'm talking today is extracted from a new book that I've written. It's called The Agile Guide to Business Analysis and Planning. If you want to learn more, we're just going to scratch the surface, but we will, dig in a little bit on some topics. The book's available on Amazon, and I hope that if it piques your interest, you'll have a look at it. You mentioned the earlier book, the UML for the IT business analyst, and I just want to go back to that. That was the first book that I wrote, and it started back in the 90s when I was working with companies on what was then known as iterative incremental development. And that evolved into what we know as agile today. And still, I would say the basic, the primary practice in agile development is to go iterative incremental, which means don't have a waterfall life cycle where you do everything up front and then you start to do the work all in one single pass. Do many little mini passes of something that is similar to that, and you get a better result. So that's now evolved. When I started to work on this, there were many companies that were beginning to do this. I would say in the 90s, it was often almost like a rogue department within a large mainstream company might say, you know what, we're going to do agile. One of the companies was a bank here in Canada, and it was their cards division that had done this. And so the problem that people were having is, how do you handle the analysis part of this story? The development side of iterative incremental and the later agile was very, very well understood, but this other part was where they were having difficulty. So that sort of became an area that I've specialized in ever since the late 90s, and going on into today, where we're not talking about a small part of an organization doing something that's like agile, but we're talking about entire agile transformations. And so I've been very intensely just working on this particular book over the past 4 years, and we'll see sort of what came out of it. So it turns out that one of the most important aspects of doing analysis in an agile context revolves around this thing called feature preparation. In fact, I've sort of offered many different subtopics to different conferences, and it seems like this one is the one that is the central one. I found that also when I go out into companies. So we're going to zero in on this today in the time that we have available. So we're going to look at this topic of feature preparation. What is this all about, and why is it actually a crucial thing to include within your process in your organization, and to do if you yourself, are a member of a team? What does it actually involve? What are the actual activities that you're going to spend your time on in this thing called feature preparation, and what are some of the framework, or let's say practices, general practices that govern how that work is done? And because we're tight on time, I won't be able to look at all of this, but we'll look at one particular practice, ATD/BDD, which is particularly central to this topic, and we're going to dive in there. And along the way, we'll talk a little bit about minimum marketable features and a little bit about the definition of ready, which all have to play into the story. As we'll see, the definition of ready is a way to make sure that the preparation activities and practices that I'm talking about actually get done. So that's where that all fits in. And the minimum marketable feature, as we'll see, is a way to say, it's a way to formalize this idea that you shouldn't try to plan the entire world all at once. You should plan the next step. And in the case of features, it means what is the minimal version of that feature that we could send out. That's what MMF is all about. So just a little bit of a preview of what we're going to dive into today. So let's get started. What is this thing called feature preparation? Now, when I got started out on this path, the first thing that most of us would have done back then, and do I have that book with me here? Oh, no, I thought I had it behind me. It's the original Agile development book using Scrum. I think it was called Agile Development with Scrum. And the book is really just about this thick. I mean, we're talking about, you know, very, very thin paperback book. And one of the things that made it thin was there was almost no talk whatsoever. In fact, there was no talk at all about business analysis, requirements analysis. It just wasn't there. There was reference to these things called product backlog items, but no reference to the work that you have to do to get them there and to understand them. It's now changed. And so in the Scrum Guide today, we finally have a recognition of that. And it's referred to in the Scrum Guide as product backlog refinement. I'm just referring this in a more generic way of feature preparation, because what I'm talking about applies whether or not you're doing Scrum, which has that particular terminology, or you're doing Kanban or any of the other frameworks. This is always an important thing to do. So what is it? Now that Scrum has recognized it, how do they define it? It's about basically looking at requirements items that are coming up. Some of them may not just be about requirements items, so that's why they say PBIs, product backlog items, but we're going to focus on the requirements ones. Breaking them down. So if you've heard about splitting of stories, that's what they're referring to there. We want to break down the requirements items because we want to implement them in a way that each little piece that we implement actually delivers some value to the user or to the business. So we want to break it down and further define the product backlog items, because when we initially put them in, they're not fully understood. That's because we're using an incremental approach where we do a little bit at a time. And ultimately, we want to get to smaller, more precise items. It's an ongoing activity. Almost every word here in this definition is extremely important. It's an ongoing activity means that this is not something you do all up front at once and you've understood it and that's it. No, you start with a rough idea and you work your way slowly in an ongoing way, adding more and more detail, more and more understanding. What are some of the details that they mention here? Description, that's, what is the requirement? We often write that in this Connextra format, which I'll show you later on today. I'm sure many of you have already seen it. The order means what is its sequence in the product backlog, because that sequence is the order in which we are going to implement. And then size is the estimate of the amount of effort that's required to actually do it. By the way, this isn't, this doesn't, what does details mean, for example? It's purposely mushy. In the Agile Guide, in my book, I've added a lot more detail to this, add details. So things like cost of delay, WSJF, weighted shortest job first. It's a way to help you prioritize items. That can be in there. A log of changes to the requirements are also, attributes or information that's associated with each requirement item, things like that. So when does this all happen? The idea, it's a continuous thing that happens up until implementation begins. In fact, we're still understanding things even as implementation gets going, but I'm going to focus on the work that happens beforehand because that's the stuff that's not obvious. And we are preparing items at different levels of granularity. At any time in a product backlog, because of this idea that we focused on the nearest items and put most of our effort into that first and less focus on items that are far away, because they're distant and the rules may change and we may not even want to do them by the time we get to them. So we tried not to do too much of that, but you end up with various levels of granularity of the items that are in your product backlog. Some of them are big items that have not been refined yet and they have not been split into smaller pieces, and those are the far away ones. And some of them are much more detail. Those should be the ones that are closer up where you've done more preparation. And to get that idea across, just to give you an idea how the whole thing is contextualized in the entire product development life cycle, I've drawn up this little wave, wave drawing, and this kind of governs everything that's in the book. So at each chapter, you can see what the topics are and circles, about what we're focusing in on right now. So right now, today in our webinar, we're looking at feature preparation and story preparation. What you'll see here in this picture is that going from left to right, these are zones of activity. In other words, they're sort of times in the product's life cycle when we're focusing on certain things versus other things. So at the very, very beginning, we're seeding the backlog. We're putting the initial items in there. And the items that are close by, that are near, that we're about to do soon, those are the ones that we do feature and story preparation on. And then once the ball gets rolling and implementation is running, we then continue doing more preparation for items that are coming up. So think of it as a rolling activity. Of course, there's lots more going on. We're focusing only on that. So at the beginning of our project, there's also all sorts of visioning going on, hypothesis testing, and so on. But again, we're focused on this feature preparation topic. So I wanted to give you an idea about why it's important. And I think the best way is just through an example. And I gotta give lots of examples like this. It's just one I have sort of prepared and been using. Let's take an example of an organization. And this is actually taken, I've made some changes for privacy, but this is something roughly like this was presented to me. So an organization comes to you and they've got a number of user stories. And possibly these user stories are done by different teams. Doesn't have to be, but often they're done by different teams. So let's say that we wanted to implement a COVID testing process. And if we think about the whole value stream, what would be involved if nothing existed yet? Well, we have to have a way for someone to order the test in the first place. And that might be some healthcare provider or somebody at the other end of the phone when you call. We have a way, we also have somebody who has to manage test appointments for the patient. So at the other end, the place where I'm going to go to get, to get my test, they now have to look at the appointments coming up and manage that end. When I show up for my test, I need a nurse who's going to administer the test to me, and that nurse has to be able to record those results in the system. And then finally, somebody who is in charge of my overall health, maybe it's my family doctor, should be able to view what my test results are. So this is just a hypothetical example. But what happened in this type of situation? One of the directors came to me and said, we have a recurring problem within the organization. When something like this comes up, crazy thing happens. Every user story has certain acceptance criteria, tests that it must pass in order to be considered done, to be considered okay, ready to go. Well, it turns out that every one of these user stories passes its tests. The trouble that they kept finding is when they put all the user stories together, they got failures, right? So if you actually put through a single patient and ordered the test and went through all these steps, these pieces would not fit together. And she said, we have this recurring problem, and can you help me here? I said, all right, I started to dig in. I said, well, obviously this wouldn't be happening if somebody actually analyzed this workflow up front, figured out what the data, input and output requirements were of each step, and you make sure that everything, flowed properly. And if there were common issues and common rules that applied across the board, again, that would be determined beforehand. So I said, just make sure that happens. She said, well, I'm trying to, but no one ever does it. I said, well, why doesn't anybody do it? Well, she said, well, there's a whole bunch of problems here. And this is all real, by the way. Number one, she says, every team thought the other team was going to do it. So that's one of the excuses that she heard. Because if you think about it, one team might be focused on the healthcare provider's interface, another one on the receptionist, another one on the primary caregiver, and so on, but no one is focused on the whole. So that was one issue. She said, even if I was able to do this, push them into, there are other problems as well. And I've kind of sort of summarized what these are. One was, she said, there's a belief that this isn't something we should be doing anyway. That you don't do requirements analysis. You don't have to do process analysis in Agile. You take it story by story. Well, the reality that I had to explain to her was, no, in fact, it does exist in Agile. It just isn't maybe wasn't recognized at first, and it's also even today not called often by that name. It's often called backlog refinement, as we just saw that word, or the specifications of acceptance criteria. I even had an editor of my own book say, why are you talking about requirements? We don't talk about requirements in Agile, we talk about acceptance criteria. Call it what you like, it is what it is. We still have to do it, even if we give it another name. Another myth was that they said that we also had no place to put this kind of analysis work, because we were told that what goes into the product backlog item are stories, and stories have to deliver code. And if you're just going to sit there and study business process rules, or, that's not delivering any working code. What I had to explain to them is, you are right that user stories must deliver working code that provides extra functionality for a user, but that's not the only kind of the story that there is. A story must deliver value, but that value is not always something that you can see as working code. There is something called enabler stories, also known as spikes, which is all about setting things up for a future story, and that's where this all fits in. And then the other chink in the armor and why things weren't working well is because they also believe that testing activities is something that you only worry about at the end of development. And so when it came to this end-to-end test, like stringing all the user stories together, they didn't really think about specifying that test until they were ready to do it. The trouble there is that if there is an integration problem, you're going to find at the very, very end, just before release time, when it is the worst time for something like that to happen, you have to do all that rework. So the reality is that that's not the way that it should be done. Following the acceptance test-driven development, and BDD stands for behavior-driven development. These are two associated ideas. The idea there is that you actually specify the tests before development begins so that everybody has a common understanding. And so that as pieces start to get implemented and they can be integrated and tested together, the test cases are already there and you just turn them on as the pieces come in. And so you're less likely to get this huge integration problem at the very end because you've been doing your testing incrementally. So from that kind of, I guess, discussion based around that example, we can, come up with some general, I guess, conclusions really about what the benefits are, why we really should do this. Number one, by preparing features beforehand. And preparation, as we'll see, it's a collaborative activity. So it means really meeting with the whole team and with stakeholders. It means then that every member of the team, from the business all the way down to the developers and testers, and all the teams that are working on a project or an initiative, they all have a shared understanding of the things that they need to understand in the same way, like business rules. By doing this feature preparation, it means there's going to be less communication. Less communication means less errors. It means less rework, because we're going to understand things properly the first time and there's less chance of mismatches between teams. And because it's for the same reason, less integration errors. We're also finding that we get fewer delays. And one of the reasons for the fewer delays is that when we do sprint planning, one of the inputs is the estimate for the stories that are going to go into the sprint. And the same, by the way, we'll see is also true about when we plan the features that are going to go into a release cycle. If we understand those work items better, because we've spent some time preparing it beforehand, then the estimate of the developers is going to be better. And so we're going to get fewer delays because we have more accurate estimates going in the first place. Now, by the way, that does not mean we should do necessarily a full upfront analysis before anything starts. We try to do always as little as possible, just enough to prevent these kind of delays that I'm talking about, but no more than we need to. Another big advantage is that, many people, many of the teams that I've gone into have said, we really like this use case approach as a way to, document requirements, or we like decision tables as the way to do, define business rules and so on and so on. But they write these requirements and they do these models after the fact, right after development occurs. The trouble with that is that when you do something after the fact, it's never really totally reliable because everybody's in a rush at that point, doesn't get done properly. If you do follow the acceptance ATD, the acceptance test-driven development approach, you're actually writing those test cases beforehand and they drive development, right? So they're going to be correct because they're actually what people used in the first place to develop them. And they are the tests. They remain afterwards, these acceptance criteria, as tests to test the software when you're doing regression testing later on. And finally, another benefit is that it ensures that the highest value items are worked on because we are reevaluating the value, rediscussing the value of items shortly before implementation. And, you know, sometimes something that looked like a really promising idea beforehand isn't. And so we end up actually avoiding doing that kind of work that shouldn't really be done. So now let's have a look at what some of these activities are. What do I mean when I say prepare the features? I mean specify, negotiate, and prioritize requirements items. Features and stories are both requirements items, but at different sizes. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And their acceptance criteria. It means right sizing. In Agile, because we do things piecemeal, we have to have things in pieces. So making sure that the requirements item is the right size for the right time. Stakeholder analysis, so understanding our users and other stakeholders. Doing classic analysis, you know, that means all that process mapping that if you're a legacy BA using traditional techniques, that comes into play here, business rules analysis and so on. And there are other things that are not strictly business analysis, or they have crossovers with other, or they're not business analysis at all. They might be another competency. But so, for example, the preparation of wireframes, sort of a UX job that you might be doing in conjunction with UX, or you've got a UX designer there who's doing that. And then there's technical things that have to happen as well. For example, communication protocols, if they have to be changed because you have to talk to another piece, or just to determine what they are, building of infrastructure. So just getting everything ready so that by the time the schedule says that a feature has to be worked on, we're actually ready to hit the ground running. Now, I mentioned that a way to ensure that all of these activities actually, I mean, it's great to have a rule in place that says everybody does them, but how do you actually make sure that these things actually happen? I mean, this organization that I spoke to, one of the problems was the people at the managerial side knew it had to happen, but they couldn't make it really happen. So one of the ways is just to use this device called a definition of ready. It's similar to a definition of done, except it's different timing. A definition of done is something that most of us know from Scrum, which is used to determine if a user story that's been worked on is actually complete enough, right, to be acceptable to the user. A definition of ready is a little bit different. It says, let's look at this work item beforehand and see if it's ready to go into the next phase of planning. So a DOR then is the minimum conditions for a product backlog item to enter into something. And why something? Because we can define it for sprint planning, or we can define it typically also for quarterly planning, and the rules are a little bit different. Let's have a look at it as an example on the next slide. Here's an example of a feature DOR. So think of a feature as a large work item that can take up to an entire quarter to develop, and it could take more than one team. So this is the kind of thing that we define before quarterly planning. If you don't call it that, you might call it release planning, or if you're somebody from the SAFe, using that framework, you might call it PI planning. So it's at that point you determine which features are most likely to get done within that time frame of that planning period. So, and those are going to be large features. We're just we're looking at things that can be done within a quarter, not within just a 2-week time frame at this point. So for a feature to be thrown into that planning cycle, we say, well, it must pass the feature definition of ready, right? Which means a set of conditions that we define. So I'm not here telling you that this is exactly, thank you, Volha, that this is exactly what you should call these things, the conditions that you should use, but this is a starting point to give you an idea. So it is typical things. For a feature to be entered into the release cycle or quarterly planning cycle, it should be at a size where it could be actually finished within that cycle by one or more teams. It should be prioritized. We should define for that feature what the minimum acceptance criteria are in order to deliver value. Not all the acceptance criteria are not necessary, but the minimum that would be required for this to be marketable to our customers. And we should identify the teams who are likely to implement that feature, and they should be committed, because we don't want to start working on a feature unless we know that everybody who is supposed to be, that we're going to need to work on it, is actually available. And at the story level, by this point, we have broken down these features into smaller things called stories, and we're planning the next 2-week period. I'm saying roughly, because there are differences. But so what does a story have to, what conditions does it have to satisfy to be ready in that way? Well, it should be small. What does small mean? It can be completed within a sprint because you're planning a sprint. It should be doable by a single team, not a group of teams. So that's what I mean by small. It should be estimable, estimable. It should be understood well enough to be estimated or actually estimated. It should be complemented by supporting artifacts as your organization determines, typically at least wireframes and things like that should be in there. The story should, and its acceptance criteria should be approved. And since it's a single team that's going to work on it, we should know who that team is. And this work of preparing the stories, I mentioned, is a collaborative affair, and that's what this is supposed to get across. We often talk about the triad in Agile. It means the three perspectives that should always be represented as you are preparing features and stories. We need to have the QA represented because they're going to create the test cases based upon these requirements, and they understand edge cases. We want the PO to be involved because the PO understands what's valuable about each story. And if we have to start negotiating, you know, let's lose this, but we'll save this in order to get the work done in the amount of time, it's the PO who knows the relative value of all of that. And it's the development team who actually knows how long everything's going to take and why, what makes the feature big. And so if we're negotiating, they can say, well, you know what, if you take this piece away, it's all going to work out really well. You're going to be able to finish in time. And then where's the BA? I'm sorry, I just clicked on something. We'll just pull it back. There it is. And where's the BA? The BA is orchestrating this whole thing. The BA is challenging others to look for places, ways that they could deliver the main value, which the PO can tell you about, without the bigness, which is what development can tell you about. So that's, if you're a business analyst, that's where you fit into that picture. Now, I've mentioned a lot about features and stories. So there's an example here just about how many of the organizations that I work with break down requirements items by size. So an epic might be a requirement item that cuts across the whole company or across the whole product. Here I have somebody wants to introduce drop shipping. And they give the reason for it. We want people to be able to order more products, and we want the company to make more money, but we don't want to increase our inventory. And so drop shipping allows somebody to order directly and with the answer coming, or with the product coming directly from the supplier. It's broken down to a bunch of features. One of them is here, enable dropship product identification and assortment planning. So this only affects one division, the assortment planning division. Other divisions will be affected for the epic, but for this feature, it's all about this little piece. And so we're assuming that there would be, let's say, a group of teams that are tied to assortment planning on a fairly permanent basis, and they're going to work on this. And they're going to be able to finish that within a quarter. And then finally, we have that broken down into stories small enough that each, one team could do it within roughly about 2 weeks. So that story, that final thing at the bottom is I call the atomic requirements unit for agile development. I should say, by the way, though, that the level just above it that you saw, the level of feature, that's actually the level in which we do the documentation, the documentation that you save. I'm sorry, I keep touching something here and it keeps pulling me ahead. So, and we say that a story has to deliver some kind of value. And I just wanted to clarify what I said a little bit earlier about what that value really is. It could be user value, which is what most people understand. I can do something as a user that I couldn't do before. That's what user value is, right? Or I can do it better than I could do it before. Or a bug is gone. Business value would be some other value to the business. For example, we're able now to monetize some functionality that we weren't able to monetize before. The user won't be so happy with that, by the way. It's not, I would say that's zero user value, but it's great business value. Then there's sometimes learning value. Actually, we don't get anything usable out of the story, but we do gain understanding. An MVP is a way to get understanding about whether or not we're on the right track and we should be plowing more money into this feature or into this product. A functional spike is to gain more understanding about a particular feature and to understand it well enough to actually start working on it. And sometimes some of these don't offer anything at all that a user can see, but they offer technical benefits. For example, increasing the maintainability of the software. It's important, but it's not a user benefit. So understand then that stories could do all of those things. And the way they're written, usually they're written following a template, and it's not necessary. By the way, a story is a story if it follows all the things that we just said earlier on the previous slide. But Yeah, it typically follows a format because the format just makes sure that you've addressed all the important issues. And I would say basically, here's the story. When you're just initially planning the stories and in the early days with them, just write them on a post-it note or the equivalent, an equivalent to that in as few words as possible, if it's well understood amongst everybody working on it. But once they enter the product backlog, and it may take a while till we actually get to it, it's usually a good idea to put it in a more formal format so important issues are addressed. So the Connextra format does that. It's called sometimes the role, feature, reason template, because it begins with who, the role, as the service representative. And then the feature is the functionality that I want. I want to triage an incident. This would be an incident management system. And then the reason is usually a so that clause, so that high priority items are expedited. We like to put the rationale in there because we may have to negotiate this story. We may not be able to get it exactly the way we want it. And so maybe we could give you something else that's equivalent and you'll still get the so that. You'll still be able to expedite your high priority items. And I don't know if you're using this at all, but this is becoming a little bit more popular now too. It's called the job story, and basically eliminates the user and instead puts the context up front, or another version of this puts the reason up front. And the reason we take the user out is because often, let's say you're doing a shopping site, the user is always going to be the shopper. So why bother even saying so? So what about, when do we do this? I said that this is something that's an ongoing activity, which means that as items are coming up, we're starting to work on them. What does that actually mean? Well, if we're preparing the upcoming quarter, so we're doing quarterly planning, when do we start to prepare features for the upcoming quarter? A very rough rule of thumb would be about halfway into the previous quarter is when you should start doing that. Now, part of that preparation is to break down those features into small stories. When do we start looking at the stories and making sure that they satisfy the story definition of ready? Well, you should start inspecting them about 2 iterations. Iteration means a sprint, so about 2 sprints before the planned, the expected implementation date. And that is so that if there are some problems, let's say a dependency on another team and you have to work something out with them and it affects their plan, there's enough time for them to do what they need to do in time for you to deal with the story. But in terms of the actual work on the story, that's just, to notify people. But the actual real work on the story typically begins about halfway into the previous iteration. So in other words, if it's a 2-week iteration, 2-week sprint, in the week number 2, you're starting to look at the stories for the upcoming sprint. Again, just a general guideline. The overall, that's a rule of thumb, but the overall rule that you should follow is the LRM, last responsible moment rule, which says you do just enough work that you're not going to pay for it later on in the end. So in this particular case, it means do just enough work. If you're before sprint planning, do just enough work on the story so that you can estimate them with enough accuracy, right, to say that, will I be able to fit this into a sprint or not? And also understand enough so that you won't get stuck once the sprint begins waiting for some information, right, waiting on something that's going to slow everybody down. You want people to hit the ground running. Don't do anything more than you have to do, because too much ultimately leads to waste, because the requirements might be out of date by the time you get to them if you start to do this too early. And if you go too deep and too much detail, you're going to constrain the developers. So now just to focus in on our last topic, and I see we're getting very tight on time, so we'll just make sure we cover it. ATDD stands for Acceptance Test-Driven Development. There's a related idea called behavior-driven development that came up separately. It was developed by Dan North in 2006. I put them together because they're very related and there's a lot of crossover between them. When BDD came about, it was very much about developing a common language and a realization. I had this realization myself a few years ago, but I never wrote a book about it at the time. It was that testing is really not all that different from requirements gathering. For example, I noticed this first with decision tables. I was creating decision tables to come up with test scenarios, but it occurred to me that I should really be doing those decision tables right up front, because they explain the business rules that the system has to follow. So in fact, the decision table is really both. And that is the key concept that Dan North realized. These are, requirements and tests are really one and the same. We should talk about them in the same way. Now, he came up with a particular way to talk about them, which is now known as the gherkin language. And I'll show you an example of that. And so what he realized then is that ATD, BDD, this whole practice is, it's centered around the word testing, right? You know, the T there is testing, but it's actually really about requirements. If the acceptance criteria that you write, these so-called tests, are not satisfied, it means that the system is not behaving properly. In other words, it didn't satisfy the requirements. So what are those rules? Number one, specify, here's the general practices that should stick with you more than the gherkin I'm about to show you. Specify your tests before coding. That's number one. People should not begin coding, or in general, I would say implementing, unless they understand what the test cases are, because that is the clearest way to let them know what's good and what's not good. Use specific scenarios. It's when you're having your discussion with the business side, turns out to be more useful to talk about specific cases to drive out the requirements than to talk in general about rules. Use a structured natural language so that everybody from testers all the way up to the business side understands everything in the same way. And that way, if somebody wants to change something, that thing is actually called by the same name all the way down to the code. Use an iterative incremental approach. In other words, don't try to get all the acceptance criteria up front. This whole thing is a collaboration, we saw that Triad. All those people are involved in refinement, and it's more important that it be a collaboration, that you use the right, particular tool. And when you are defining and preparing these features, focus on what has to be done right now, right, on the highest value scenarios. And that's captured in this idea of the minimum marketable feature, which is basically the smallest version of the feature that would be viewed as valuable by customers if released to the market. In other words, we want a competitive feature out there that would not be viewed as an amateur hour feature by our customers. You just can't throw that out there. It may be quote unquote done, it works, but it's just not rich enough for it to be marketable. And so that's what we try to define. Here's some examples. You can focus on differentiating capabilities. When Google Docs was first developed, the first version of that was actually called Writerly, and it focused on differentiating capabilities, the ability to share the document and work on it in real time. But a lot of the other things that you would expect of a word processing application were not in there. A lot of the formatting things, for example, were not in there. They'd have to be in there eventually. But in the first version of it, they didn't bother to put it in because they wanted to build a excited group of early evangelists, right? People for whom the sharing would be such a powerful thing they would overlook those other aspects. You might focus your MMF on time-consuming activities. So a colleague of mine, and I talk about this case in the book, created this company called Triad, and what it does is it's really aimed at journalists, and it's about working on the transcription of interviews. That takes a long time for a typical journalist to do. And so the first version, the MMF, the minimum marketable feature, focused on those very time-consuming activities of transcription and did not focus on 100% accuracy. They allowed the journalists to go in and do the fixing themselves. It's not a 100% solution, but in fact, it works just as well. You may focus on the most frequently used aspects. So I work with a group on incident management, and they focused on the kind of things that happen daily, kind of incidents that happen daily. And if they could automate those and make those, work well, then the few incidents that they couldn't handle, that required, that were very time consuming, it was okay that they couldn't handle them, that they had to be done manually because they didn't happen very often. And you also just might look at, is there some way that we can just get a quick win out here that without a lot of effort, we could make an impact and get buy-in from our users and also from the funders. So those are all sort of considerations that go into place when you think about a minimum marketable feature. The sort of general philosophy behind it is that every feature, in effect, is a hypothesis. Unless you're absolutely sure that, about every aspect of that feature, it's a hypothesis. And we don't really know when we have a hypothesis of some, there's certain assumptions that people will find this feature to be valuable, or aspects of the features, but we don't really know until we put it out there. So the approach is favor experimentation over research to determine value. Put out a light version or even a proof of concept for the feature first, let people play with it, and based upon that feedback, find out which aspects are the most valuable and focus your attention on those. And you use involved data analysts early in order to do that, because they need to determine what metrics you're going to use to see if the feature, if you're on the right track with that feature. And we often do A/B testing to do that. In other words, we may expose one group of users to this solution for the feature, another group of users to, well, we don't change anything at all, and see if there's a difference between the two. We might even try an alternate solution with group C, and we compare the results. And then we have this idea of a minimum marketable product. If you take all of your MMFs and let's say it's the beginning of a new product and you pull them together, well, that whole thing together is your minimum marketable product that should go out there as your first version of the product. So I mentioned incident management. There's just an example here where an incident manager, well, we have acceptance criteria to handle the most common and most time-consuming incidents, but we haven't put in, for example, emergency incidents. And by the way, the real reason behind that in the real world was that when it came to emergencies, they had to have integration with police systems and municipal systems, and that would be very expensive to do and costly and didn't provide enough value. And so following these practices gives us, of ATDDD, it gives us consistent language because we're using an English-like language all the way through, increased maintainability and testability, and so on. All the things I talked about really come through here. In terms of who owns it, it changes by organization, but either the BA may own the entire feature file or the team as a whole. It's a shared ownership. And in these feature files are the stories and acceptance criteria that have to be satisfied. I wanted to give you an example of what it looks like. You may not, it's not important, by the way, that you have to follow the gherkin approach, but it's very, very common to get these ideas across. So here I have an example. Again, going back to that dropship product identification, free-form description. So the first thing you see follows the template that I mentioned earlier, then a free-form description. The scenario, I can identify a dropship eligible product. So here is a test case. And then we have an explanation of that test case. Given that I'm signed in as so-and-so, when I query product so-and-so, then I should see the following message. We have the setup, that's the given. We have the trigger for the test case, and then we have the net result of the test case. So that's what's nice about this language, is that so the main issues are right there. And this language is actually written so nicely that there are products out now, if you're using Cucumber, for example, that will take these words, right, and connect them to actual test code. And here's a more complex example. Again, you see the given, when, then, but I've added things like the and, because we can have multiple conditions that may or may not be true. And instead of putting specific values, that I am Jane Tyndall or whatever, I can just put in variable names or field names, and then actually describe below, where I have these examples, what those field names are. And so with that, folks, that ends our story for the day. We're tight on time, but my goodness, I think we just got in there under the wire. So again, just a reminder that if this kind of tweaked your curiosity, there's lots more about everything I talked about in the Agile Guide to Business Analysis and Planning. And I will send this off now to Lydia, who I guess we have a few minutes for some Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Howard, for such an amazing presentation. We actually do have a few questions from the audience. So if you don't mind, I will start with the most popular one.
Sure.
So the question is from Sergey Nalivaiko. What was missing in the first book that you decided to publish the new one? So maybe a few points that you can highlight.
This is the most popular question.
Well,
yeah.
They're business analysts. They're, like digging to the root.
Sure. All right. Well, okay. So two things. So the very first book was UML for the IT business analyst. What was missing there is that it dug in on iterative incremental development, but not the other aspects of Agile. Right. So we don't talk about product ownership in there. The actual process that you follow, how to handle Agile at scale, all those issues are not in there. And that's because they really weren't, they weren't prevalent at the time. The handbook, which is the second book I wrote, it's a different kind of book than this book. That's more of an encyclopedia. So it's a reference manual, literally, that, I've got a diagram in front of me and I don't know how to read it. How can I do it? Or I have to write a use case and I don't know how to write it. Give me a template. And so I've just basically collected over the years all of the kinds of things that people needed as job aids to do their job, and just listed them all in the manual. You look it up, you find your thing. It's not meant to be read, it's meant to be referenced.
Cool.
The other thing about it is that that was a mixed book, and I was mixing Agile with Waterfall into one big book because it was meant for any BA in any environment. But the other side of it is that Agile wasn't as mature as it is today when that was written. So to this book now, what it does in contrast to the two is, like the first book, it actually walks you through the process. It's meant to be read. It's not just a reference manual. You look things up. So that's one thing that's different. And number two, it's totally focused on an Agile context with everything that's now coming with Agile. The higher level, so it includes circumstance market segmentation, discussion of the different roles and who does what, and much deeper coverage of user stories, and on and on. It's it's basically a how-to. Let's actually follow, as a reader, let's follow a story from beginning to end of a new product development, and let's see how Agile development actually flows through. So it's a narrative versus the handbook, and it's totally Agile.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So again, highly recommended to read this book, especially since it's available in our library as well. So check it out, and I'm sure you will find a lot of valuable information that will make your life as a BA easier and just make you a better professional. Okay, so the next question is from Milan Razonix. In a cross-functional team setup, who is responsible for writing acceptance criteria for testing in a ATDD approach?
Yeah, so it's if you have an analyst on your, by the way, there's no law about this, right? But generally speaking, if you have an analyst on your team, the business analyst is the one who's writing the AC. Now, it does vary though. In some organizations, the business analyst writes the wordy thing that you saw there in the previous example that doesn't have the given, when, then, and a technical person writes the given, when, thens, and ultimately the code that lies underneath it. That technical person should generally be actually not a tester. It's a coder does both today.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
So the coder writes their own tests.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yes, it was the second most popular question, which was pretty closely rated to the first one. Okay, so the next one, again from Milan Razonix, but his questions get likes, so that's why he gets a chance to ask another one.
You're it, man. You're the guy.
Awesome. So does MMF equal to MVP, minimal viable product?
Oh, I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah. Is there more to the question?
Yes, sorry, I will just finish, okay? So, or is it only focuses on feature level and may not stand on its own when released, but only have value for the product owners? So yeah.
Okay, I see. No, the minimum marketable feature is meant to be marketed. So if the acceptance criteria for the minimum marketable feature are satisfied, the idea is that yes, at the discretion of the product owner, but is actually ready and competitive enough to be thrown out there. But I do want to make it, it brought up something I wanted to get across. There's a lot of confusion between an MVP and MMP. So I just want to clarify that too, sort of make another question out of that.
Awesome.
And I think that the questioner Milan did understand this. MVP stands for minimum viable product, and that is not actually meant to be sent out to the market necessarily. So it's meant for testing and for learning purposes only, but you don't actually have to have a really marketable version. It's meant really for testing. Now, if we take all the minimum marketable features, which are meant for marketing, and we add them up, we get a minimum marketable product, a whole product that you could actually put out into the marketplace. So MMP and MVP are different from each other.
Awesome. Thank you so much for making this note. I think it really helped to structure the knowledge for our audience. So thanks a lot. We still have some questions, so bear with me, please. The next one is from Marta Taranko. How do you build such a culture in your team where everyone feels accountable for participating actively in feature preparation? Sometimes dev and QA team are resistant to the involvement at early stages of requirements preparation. So how do you tackle this situation? If you could share with the audience.
I don't have a ready answer for you on that. I have to think a little bit about it. But I mean, I can say in general, though, where has this worked in organizations and where has it not? it's work when you ultimately when you have backing and championship at all levels of the organization. So you need the product owner for that team on board. But if you're doing things properly, you have a leveling. So you've got, you know, intermediate levels of chief product owners, or you might call them RTEs if you're in SAFe or whatever. I call them product owners or area product owners. But you need that all the way up to the executive level in order for this to work well. It's not that so you need the commitment. And then the way that it seems to work best is take a few teams who are doing this collaboration and doing it properly, have them bring other teams into their sprint demos so that other teams who aren't doing this now will actually see the benefits of working that way, and hopefully you can spread, you know, the culture in that way.
Awesome tip. And you said you were not prepared. To me, it seemed like a great answer. So thanks a lot to that. Okay, so moving on to the next one.
I mean to say, don't think it's going to be easy though.
Yeah, well, I can imagine. Okay, awesome. Thanks a lot. Okay, so the next one is from Konstantin Lukyanenko. Any approaches for LRM? How do I know if it's just enough? Yeah,
so I'd say in general, it's through experience. So I really like the idea of a definition of ready, because that is where the knowledge and experience that you've gained within your organization is really solidified, I guess, or it becomes institutionalized. So if you've, you know, I've given in the book and also on these slides some starting points for these definitions of ready, and they basically say how much preparation should be done at this particular point in the feature's life cycle or in the story's life cycle. I'd start with those. And then if you find that it's too much preparation, you might drop some conditions, or maybe they're too restrictive. For example, do you need all of the acceptance criteria? We said no, just the minimum that are required, but how deep you need to go in expending them? Do you need them only as brief descriptions, or do you need the given when then format? Well, you play around with different things and see if I've gone too far, or I could have got away with a little bit less. And so that learning gets pumped back into the definition of ready. So think of it as an evolving thing. A good time to think about those definitions of ready is during your retrospectives. That's the time when you're really looking at your practices, see if it needs revision.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so another question also from Konstantin Lukyanenko also gets some likes, so that's why another question from him. So during discovery, we often estimate on the feature level. Seems like the question got deleted, so that's why I will jump to the next one. I'm sorry. I couldn't finish it. Yeah. So the next one.
I think it's a quick answer to what I think the question is.
Yeah, probably. Yes. Okay.
All right. So it sounds like it has to do with the accuracy of the estimates on features at the very beginning, when you're doing release planning, for example, when you're really looking at those features. And if that's the question, I'd say we don't need huge accuracy at that time. So if you can tell me the features is something that's going to take me days, months, or years, or some people use shirt sizes, you know, is it a small, medium, or large? That's enough. That's usually enough for your purposes.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. So actually, I figured the question just jumped because another questions got pop up. So I will read the question one more time, okay? Sure. So during discovery, we often estimate on the feature level. Should features be also estimatable?
Yes, they should. Yes, they should be estimable, but as I said, not to the same accuracy as stories.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Roman K. When speaking about agile at scale and planning for the next PI in the middle of the current PI recommended for SAFe, how do we make sure that we have enough time and capacity in teams doing current sprints work and analysis, plus the need to look more into the future for this planning and analysis in advance? So basically, yeah. I think the question is about like allocation of time, and time management. Kind of thing.
Well, it's more challenging, and it's the reason why in SAFe, sort of the default was originally to have. In fact, I think they still have it like that now. They have an iteration or a sprint in between what they call PIs, which is similar to a release cycle. And that's how they ensure that it happens, right? They actually just say, oh, we're going to spend a couple of weeks, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to plan the next thing. Many organizations are finding today, if that's necessary for you, that's what you're going to have to do, and then you'll definitely have time. But most agile organizations today that I work with don't find that's necessary. They found that they're able to, as long as they start about halfway into the previous release and begin having meetings, and they can even be informal ones, to plan the features that are coming up, that's enough, and they don't have to actually stop work in order to do this. And I'd say that if you can do it that way, try it. That's the preferable way.
Awesome. Okay, and the last question that we will take today, but I would really ask you to try to make it as short as you can, please, so that we are in timing. So the question is from Sachin Handelwal. How can we ensure that requirements in ATDD are not missed by devs and QA? Like we generally use RTM as artifact in waterfall.
Well, the way to make sure is that when you're using ATDD, the net result of that are acceptance criteria specifications. And so if the feature doesn't pass the acceptance criteria, it's not, it isn't accepted.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Howard, thank you so much for amazing presentation and also for very thoughtful answers. I'm sure that everybody got so much value, and especially, since your book, again, The Agile Guide to Business Analysis and Planning, since it's available in our library, I'm sure that a lot of our audience members will check it out. So again, thanks a lot for the awesome session, and I invite everybody for the next session that we have. And thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Lydia. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you too.